Now we are going to learn about how to organize and display elements in your layout, how spacing works, and also borders. For this, I have here an example of an element. It could be a heading, a paragraph, an anchor, a button, whatever. If you contain this element into a divider, into a div, the element, although it takes this spacing in your browser, okay, so this is the browser window, the container will take always full width, because the default display setting will be block, which takes full width. You can add a property called display inline, which takes only the width used by the element inside, okay? As well as you can also use what is called display flex, because by default elements, although they take only this space, they will be one on top of the other. If you want to modify how this behavior, because you want to have one element right next to the other, for this you will need to add what is called display flex or something called display grid. Both are advanced display features added in modern CSS, which we will learn in the module of responsive design, because with grid you can also add different grids, like a grid layout. Okay, so when you could divide the space in a grid like this, and you could add elements to each of these parts. Okay, grid and flex both achieve the same results, but using different techniques and different configurations. Okay, but those are advanced techniques, but it's great that you know that if you want to achieve a design like this, okay, let me refresh, where you have an image to the left and some content to the right, this is achieved with, in this case, flex. Okay, so we have a section. As you can see, it's flex. It should be, let me show you, flex. So it's display flex, and we have something called flex direction, which tells that I want the content to be in a row. Okay, so we can add the content in columns. So we only have one column, and the content is one on top of the other. That's its columns. Okay, so the content will be like this, or row, where the content will be one next to the other if it has enough space. Okay, so this one can't fit here, so it will be at the bottom. Okay, so that's display flex. And inside one of these containers, this one, I also have some elements divided with some spacing, which is also with display flex. Now I'm going to show you this with real code, and also how spacing works, because another thing I wanted to teach you is that these elements can be spaced in between them. So for example, if we want some spacing in between these elements, I can add a margin to the right to this element, and they are spaced. And maybe I want this element also to be spaced to the one on the bottom, so I add a margin to the bottom, and it will add some spacing. But there's something called padding, which is also spacing, but instead of being outside the element, it's inside the element. And that means that if I add padding here, the element will be bigger, but the thing inside will have some spacing. Okay, let me show you with a real life example. Okay, so I'm going to add a background color of red to the red container, blue to the blue container, and a color white to both of them. If I add a margin bottom of 20 pixels, you can see we have a separation between both containers. Okay, I can make it as big as I want to. But if instead of adding margin, I add padding, the spacing will be inside the element. So here I can say padding bottom of 40 pixels. Both containers are touching, they are one next to the other, but the spacing is inside the element. I can even say padding just as it is, so the spacing is all around, and that looks like this. Now, this is very commonly used for buttons. For example, imagine I want to have here an anchor, okay, and I want to make it look like a button. Okay, so click me. Now it just looks like this. A basic styling that you add is bottom. First, text decoration. We learned this in the last lesson. None, because we don't want text. Let me text. Okay, sorry, it's not a button. It's an anchor. An anchor. Text decoration none. And now, we add a background color. Let me add a okay, like this, a text color of white. Okay, so I'm going to add like this, maybe this not as dark, okay, like this, and then you add some padding of usually when you make bottoms you want a horizontal padding big, you want the horizontal padding to be bigger than the vertical one. So we add, for example, 20 pixels and 10 pixels, sorry, the opposite way, 10 pixels and 20 pixels, okay? When you only add two properties, you are adding the horizontal value, the vertical value, and then the horizontal value. You can add 4 values to add one padding to each side. So maybe I can add here 50 pixels to the bottom and 5 pixels here. So we have now a left padding, a right padding, a top padding, and a bottom padding different. We can also make this by saying padding top, padding bottom, padding right, padding left, etc. Okay, so we can make it both ways, but this is enough. And then I add a border radius of 10 pixels and we have a perfect button, but as you can see, this is overlapping content, so we need to add a margin top, in this case of 30 pixels, for example. Why is it not? Okay, because this anchor has to be inside a divider, because anchors by default, this is something we're going to be learning, anchors by default are displayed in line, and you will see, as you can see, it's not changing because it's the default display. As you will learn right now, display inline has some properties and some a particular way which it interacts with other elements, because the default display is block, which is used in containers, and you can see now the margin is being applied. So we can use, for example, inline block, and now it's adding the margin at the top, because inline block takes some properties from the inline display and some properties from the block display. The display block is what I told you earlier, that the default behavior of elements is to be one on top of the other, and the container takes the whole width. If you don't want it to take the whole width, what you say is display inline. Let me show you with this red right here. Okay, I'm going to delete the padding, and as you can see, it takes full width. But if I say display inline, it only takes the width needed. Okay, but let me show you some weird things. These are weird things that will happen to you, but it's important that you play around with these properties so you understand them. Okay, so first of all, if I add more lines here, so if I add a breaking line and more text, okay, with display block, which is the default display, so if I add here display block, it's a default display, nothing changes, okay? So with this, every time the container needs a new line, it takes it, okay? But it's always taking full width. If you want to change that, you can say instead of display block, display inline. Great. Now, with display block, you can specify the height and width of an element. Okay, so imagine I want it to be a height of 100 pixels and a width of 100 pixels because I want it to be a square. Great. If instead of saying display block, I say display inline, it won't take that height and that width, because when we say display inline, we are displaying it as an inline element, like when we are adding some text. Okay, so this is a text displaying inline because we have one word, then the next one, then the next one, then the next one, etc. But when we say display block, it takes one line per element. But we can combine them with display inline block, and now it takes the width and the height, but it's displaying it as an inline element. In fact, if I delete this and add, for example, only the height, 50 pixels, it takes the height. If I add the width, it takes the width, but it's an inline element. Great. Imagine I have two block elements and I say I want a width of 50% because I want each of them to take 50% of the space as I have here. Okay, I have one divided container here and another one here, and I want each of them to take 50%. Well, I can say width 50%, but they don't go one next to the other because, as I told you, the parent element is a block element. Okay, so I have here a section called parent. That parent element, let me add it here, parent, is display block. by default. If we want to modify the way elements are displayed, as I told you here, because I want to be them in the direction of a row, so it's one next to the other instead of one on top of the other, I need to change the display property of the parent element. Instead of block, I'm going to say flex. And now it's one next to the other, like this. But it's also adding this button right here, because it's taking, so as you can see, they are shrinking to fit. They are not using the 50% width, because for this we have to say minimum width, which we can use minimum width, and now they are taking full size, and the other element is outside. We will cover this in the responsive module to see how to handle these cases, because right now it's not the purpose to learn these things, but just so you know, they are here. At the moment, to solve this, I'm going to move this anchor outside this section, and that's it. We have solved it. Okay, so we have a width of 50% of each element, and I can also add a max width of 30%. Sorry, I don't know what width of 30%. Okay, width of 30%. Yeah, okay, max width. We can add a max width of 30% and a minimum width of 100 pixels, for example. Okay, so it will take 100 pixels, but when the screen is very small, it will take, the smallest will be 30%. Okay, so we can play with this thing. We can set a default value, but we can also allow it to change when we make the screen size smaller or bigger. But again, this will be on the responsive module, but there are some things that you need to know now. Okay, so I can here say 30% width and 70%, so I have one bigger than the other. Okay, great. So we know about margin, we know about padding. Okay, margin is the spacing outside the element, like this. Padding is the spacing inside the element. Okay, so I'm going to add 5 pixels. Now we have the border. The border is around the element. So in this case, I'm not going to use a background color red. I'm going to make a very light red, like this. Okay, and now I'm going to add a border, and the properties, sometimes you can combine them only using border, or you can add each one of them separately. So I can add a border color of a red, okay, but I'm going to make it a bit darker. Great, now it's not shown because we need to add a border width of 1 pixel, for example. And now let me make it bigger. Border color, border width. Okay, and now we need to add the border style, which is going to be solid. And now it's showing. Okay, we have solid. We have many options. We have dust, for example, which is this display, dotted, which are dots, etc. The most used one is solid, and usually 1 pixel or 2 pixels is more than enough. And we can also add border radius of 10 pixels, for example, so it looks rounded. And we can even make a text align center, so the text is in the middle, and we are creating another kind of button, more or less. Okay, so these are all properties we can add to the border, and the border is in between the margin and the padding. This is important when you create the display, the layout you want to, when you know the layout you want to design. It's important to know that if you want to add a border and to have some spacing in between that border and the element and the text, you need to add padding. But if you want that button, that border to have some spacing to other elements, you need to add margin. Okay, so we have lots of properties. Display inline, so it only takes the width you want. Display block, which is the default. You have display flex, which allows you to have one element right next to the other, and you can modify it so sometimes it's one element on top of the other. We will see that on the responsive module. You can add padding, which is spacing inside the element, margin, space outside the element, borders. You can add the properties one each time, or you can add them all together. Same border, 1 pixel, solid, red, and dash. Okay, like this. Okay, dash, sorry, dash, like this, okay, and maybe 10 pixels, okay, so you can see we can add all of them together. So this is the basic spacing lesson. The best way to learn this, again, is go to a real life website. You can go to kairosplan.com and start playing around. For example, I can take this heading right here. I'm going to add to the style a background color of teal, so you can see it, and a padding of 50 pixels. So you can see the background color is being applied, but if I add a margin of 50 pixels, this background color is not being applied to that margin, okay? So this way you can play around with real life websites and try to make them look the way you want. And then get those websites and try to replicate them in your code editor, in Visual Studio Code, so you can learn by taking action.